participate freely there. Thanks, Sadaka. But this recording will be available for you all later on if you want to come back and consult it at any time. And with that, I will go ahead and pass the mic to Eli to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks, Joy. We are going to start by talking about some foundational language. And we are going to this is going to be a very brief introduction to truly some, like, literally the most foundational language that is really useful and really helpful to become comfortable with and comfortable using. If after this very short introduction, you're thinking, oh, I would love some more time to think about this language, to be able to ask a lot of questions that I have, to practice using it. Going to do another plug for our 6-hour training, because that's really the wonderful thing about that training is you have a cohort of people that you're spending sort of 2-3 hour chunks with, and a lot of the point is to become comfortable with this language. And we do a more expansive deep dive into language. Well, dive into language. But for purposes of our time today, we want to go over some fundamental definitions that it's really like useful to have a grasp of when we're talking about identities. So sex, or sex assigned at birth. Sex assigned at birth is a very specific thing. It often leads to the sort of social reading of a person's gender as a child, right? The gender that people are assumed to have is often tied to their sex assigned at birth. And one way to sort of think about and understand the idea of sex assigned at birth is literally, what does that say, right? A baby is born, a doctor looks at a baby, and typically this is based on external genitalia. And the doctor says, okay, we're going to put male or female on the birth certificate. And for most people, a lot of people, that is as simple as the assignment of sex at birth gets. It's all about that external genitalia. In fact, often this happens preliminary before someone's even born, based on I don't know if any of you have ever seen one of the images, the scans, sort of a crotch shot. My best friend is pregnant right now, and we've been having a lot of fun with sonograms. So it's a really, like, it's external. The sort of physiological, biological pieces of sex, like our sex, our biological or physiological sex, is a lot more complicated than that. When our sort of understanding of like what we put into that bucket of someone's biological sex includes external genitalia, internal genitalia, so your testes or ovaries. It involves chromosomes, genetic markers. It involves the types of hormones that your body produces, and then the types of hormones that your body has receptors for. So it's really very complicated. So anyway, sex assigned at birth, right? We're talking about like that pretty quick, usually, inspection of a baby's genitals that says, okay, this is your social identity now, you're a male or female. We're also talking about this more complex, like physiological sex, which is, not all of those pieces are going to match each other for every individual person. So I guess the point that I'm making here is, this is language, it's useful, sex assigned at birth, or physiological, biological sex. And also this thing that I think we're all used to relating to in a really, it's simple, right? It's you're male or female. It's actually a very complicated thing physiologically. All of that completely separate from our next term here, gender identity. Someone's gender identity is an internal experience, right? Who do I feel like? Do I feel like this category of people in my life that I see in the world that are women? Do I feel like this category of people in the world that I see that are men? Do I feel like neither of those categories? Do I sometimes feel like one or the other? It's your internal knowledge of who you are. And your gender identity can be aligned with your sex assigned at birth and your physiological sex characteristics, and it can be entirely separate from that. It can be different. So when we talk about the sort of someone's physiological characteristics, it's really important and useful to use sex assigned at birth or something like physiological sex, and then keep gender and gender identity in this separate category of someone's internal understanding of like who they are socially, who they are as a sort of internal identity. I want to pause there and I want to start by, so I'm going to ask a question. My question is going to be, do you all have any questions? Right. But while you're thinking of that, I'd love for you all also to like, don't put this in the chat. You don't need to share this, but just check in with yourself. What was your sex assigned at birth? What is your physiological sex and what is your gender identity? Name those for yourself, particularly if those are things that you don't often think about in terms of yourself, because everybody has a sex assigned at birth. Everybody has a gender identity. That's not exclusive to people who are LGBTQIA+. So no need to share that, but I'd love if you just check in with yourself. And then, does anybody have any questions about either of these terms? Anything you've been wondering, clarifying, anything I said a lot of words, so if any of that wasn't clear, let me know. Go ahead, Art.
So one thing that comes to mind is if a person's gender identity does not match their sex assigned at birth, does it always mean they're going to
Great.
change their sexual?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I really want to thank you, Art, for asking a question, right? Asking questions is like all what learning is all about. And even if you're like Art, I know you're confident in asking questions, but anybody in the room, like I hope that you take Art as an example. We want you to ask for information. So great question. The answer is no. There are a lot of folks, well, there are a lot of humans in the world, right? And the experience of gender queerness or being outside the sort of gender norm, being non-cisgendered, where you don't like you feel like your gender identity isn't what people expect based on your sex assigned at birth. There are as many experiences of that as there are people who experience that, right? Um, and so there are a lot of folks who the disconnect that they feel with their physical body is, is like, and the what that causes for them in the world, the friction that causes in the world, the social impacts of that, the economic impacts of that, and just the internal discomfort. There are a lot of folks who seek medical treatment, who seek surgical solutions, and that is very like affirming and important. There are also a lot of folks who don't seek any kind of physical change to their body because their relationship to their gender and their body is different, because they like the physical body that they're in. They feel connected to it, and they just don't think that has anything to do with the gender identity that they relate to. There are a lot of folks who, don't seek, physical transition or gender affirming care in that way because they can't afford it. Or because it's scary or taboo or socially unacceptable because it would be unsafe for them, with their relationships and their economic stability to do that. There are all sorts of different reasons why people seek care, that type of care, or don't seek that type of care. Great question. Okay, for time, I'm going to move us to our next definitions. Gender expression. One of the things I really appreciate about the equal access rule and HUD's regulations on this is they actually separate out gender identity and gender expression. And I think that's very useful. It's best practice. So gender expression is how you present yourself to the world. It's how you dress, what your hair looks like. Do you paint your nails or not? What style do you use? And we know that most of like when you're walking down the street and you're seeing people, everybody does this. We're all categorizing people all the time. We're interpreting the clues that we see. That's a very human thing to do. It's unavoidable. And it can be really good and fun. Gender expression is what we choose about like the cues that we put out into the world. How do we talk, all that stuff. And as we know, like a lot of the expressions that we do of ourselves are related to gender. So they can be more masculine, they can be more feminine, they can have pieces of both. I would say it's more common for people to have both feminine and masculine presentation when it really comes down to it than to be purely in one category or another, just because our categories of gender are so strict, and it's just much more common to mix it up, right? Women who wear pants, right? That traditionally is an expression of more masculine gender. That's changed a lot. But like that's the level of like most people are playing with gender expression in their day-to-day life. And then sexual orientation, completely separate thing. So sexual identity, sexual orientation are separate from and sort of happen independently from your gender identity, your gender expression, and your sex assigned at birth. This just this term is the category of who are you attracted to? Who are you attracted to physically and sexually? Who are you attracted to romantically? And so just an example here of how gender identity is separate from sexual orientation. A cisgender person, meaning someone who's sex assigned at birth and whose gender really match in the typical expected way socially. A cisgendered person can be straight, gay, bi, pan, asexual, have any sexual orientation. A transgender person, someone whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth don't fit or match in the socially expected way, can also be straight, bi, pan, ace, right? Have any of the many human sexual orientations or sexual identities. So separate, all of these four things can be very separate. Okay, so now that we have that foundation of gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, and then sexual orientation, meaning who you're attracted to physically, who you're attracted to romantically or emotionally. We love the gender unicorn. There's a lot of really fun graphics that have been created to sort of illustrate the same things. But the gender unicorn is to show you that, you know, a person's gender identity can be more female, woman, girl, can be more male, man, boy, can be aligned to a variety of other gender identities that exist in human cultures, and can be more or less of all of those things. This is not a spectrum from one end that is woman to another end that is man. This is, ooh, I'm feeling like super masculine, like I'm identifying as very much a boy today, but I'm also a little bit girl. You know, this is uh the deepest meaning of the word fluid. So gender identity is sort of along these spectrums. Gender expression can be more feminine, can be more masculine, can be in some other direction that you're playing with altogether. And it can also be both feminine and masculine at the same time. Again, not a binary between two poles, but sort of you can go in multiple different directions. Sex assigned at birth. So typically, most people are assigned female or male at birth. And there are a significant number of people who are born intersex, where that categorization as female or male is just inaccurate because someone's physiological sex does not wholly group around female or wholly group around male. So that it's pretty rare I think it's more common now for doctors to actually identify at birth someone as intersex, because historically the medical field has really tried to put people in these two categories. And then who are you physically attracted to? Who are you emotionally attracted to? Those two parts of sexual orientation can also be a little bit different. You know, there are people who are physically attracted to just human bodies, but really emotionally and romantically connect more with a certain sort of spectrum of gender identities. So yeah. Again, I would encourage you all to just self-reflect. Where are you within each of these categories? Gender identity, gender expression, and who are you attracted to in your life? You don't need to share that in the chat, but I encourage you to reflect. And then cultural identities. So I gestured at this earlier, but there are so many specific cultures in the world, historically and currently, who just never had a totally binary understanding of gender identity, and or sex assigned at birth, physiological sex. That binary understanding was very that's sort of very prevalent in European traditions and some other traditions in the world. But also there's a lot of human cultures that just didn't end there, didn't end up there with a binary understanding. So we're going to highlight two examples, but there are some great resources out there that have, extensive lists of a lot of the different interesting and special ways that human cultures have understood gender identity. So we're going to highlight just a couple, Fa'afafine and Fafatama. These are Samoan understandings of genders that move between female and male or man and woman. So these are culturally specific identities. These are identities that really grew and exist within a cultural context. So these are not terms that I, as a white person who is from California, would use or would adopt, but they're important and sort of have a long history within Samoan culture. And then Mushe. So this is a Zapotec identity, folks in the Oaxaca area. This is a gender that's been recognized again historically, that is in addition to a male or man or female or woman gender. All right. So with that, I'm going to stop babbling on and I'm going to pass to Joy to talk about the regulations.
Cool. Thanks, Eli. As Eli said, I'm going to be getting more into the regulation side of things. So it's about to get more dry. So I apologize for that. But I will do my best to keep it clear and concise. So the main piece of regulation that we're talking about today is the Equal Access Rule. So in September 2016, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, they published this Equal Access Rule in order to ensure that access to shelter, housing, and services is provided to someone in accordance with their own gender identity, which is defined as like the gender with which they identify, regardless of their sex assigned at birth or their perceived gender identity. So this rule is really meant to protect individuals with different identities, and it's meant to ensure that individuals are placed in housing in accordance with their gender identity. Really gets rid of any requirements for individuals to prove gender identity. So for example, under this rule, you can't be asking for someone to show you their ID in order to prove that they're a certain gender, things like that. This rule does apply to all recipients and subrecipients of HUD funding, including all CPD programs. Again, it ensures that they're placed in housing and programs in accordance with their gender identity, regardless of their gender expression or perceived gender. And there's also a stipulation in there that providers must update their policies and procedures to reflect requirements of this rule. And so after this training, we do share out some resources and examples of that, and you'll all get a link in your email with additional resources and information for that piece. But generally, this is what the rule provides for. And the reason that we're still talking about it, even though it's been around since 2016, is that it continues to be applied inconsistently. And so we wanted to share out some pieces of the 2022 US Transgender Survey, which is the largest survey examining the experiences of all transgender folks in the United States. And this survey actually just reflects the ongoing disparities and patterns of mistreatment and discrimination against trans folks. So in order to kind of emphasize that finding, 48% of those who saw a healthcare provider within the last 12 months reported at least one negative experience. 30% of these folks who replied to the survey had experienced homelessness in their lifetime. 9% reported that they were denied equal treatment or service in the last 12 months because of their gender identity or expression. And also those experiencing homelessness are disproportionately LGBTQIA+, especially for the youth population. So you can see here that like trans folks, queer folks, gender nonconforming folks are still experiencing high rates of homelessness and discrimination within those systems of care. So it's really important that we continue this conversation and keep providing these types of training opportunities and really emphasize the points of the equal access rule. Another point that we wanted to go over with the equal access rule is the concept of self-identifying gender. So similar to what Eli was going over with gender identity and gender expression, you can see the difference of that illustrated here. So actual gender identity, someone is identifying as a man saying I am a man, versus perceived gender identity or gender expression, you seem like a man. These are two different things, right? So we really want to be focusing on what someone self-identifies as, what their actual gender identity is. So at the core, it's about respecting and following what a person says that their gender identity is without second guessing that or asking for proof. So this is important because when we're thinking about lowering barriers to care, for example, the less people have to prove themselves in order to receive help, the less likely they are to sleep on the street and the more likely they are to trust you, right? So it's kind of interacting with people in ways that are true and authentic to them. And we also want to use our behaviors to correct some of the institutional discrimination that happens, some of the learned discrimination that happens. And it's also just about taking a client-centered approach to care, right? So we always want to honor and act in alignment with what someone's actual gender identity is and how they self-identify, rather than what someone might perceive that to be. And I'm going to stop here just for a second to see if anyone has any questions or anything about the equal access rule itself, or any of the slides that we've gone over so far. Any questions? Okay, seeing none, I will go ahead and keep it moving. Okay, so as we highlighted earlier, a big part of the equal access rule is being able to implement that as part of agency policies and procedures. So we want to make sure that these policies and procedures are ensuring equal access to programs for individuals and their families, providing housing services and accommodations in accordance with the client's gender identity, and we want to be able to determine eligibility without regards to actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. So definitely not excluding anyone intentionally or unintentionally based on these characteristics. And HUD also did release a new equal access agency assessment tool 2 years ago in August 2023. That provides some action steps for HUD recipients and subrecipients to be able to meet this rule. So we will also share that as part of the resources in our follow-up, and we encourage you to share it with your administrative staff and use it to sort of assess and maybe adjust some of the agency policies if you see the need for that. And then in terms of just something that we come across pretty commonly in terms of TA and trainings, rules regarding facilities with shared sleeping or bathing areas. This is definitely a part in which equal access rule comes into play and applies to. And so we really want to emphasize that center step right there. Providers must take any non-discriminatory steps that are necessary and appropriate to address privacy concerns raised by residents. Also, placements must be made based on an individual's gender identity, and facility admissions, occupancy, and operating policies must be updated to ensure compliance. So essentially, just to throw out an example, say in a facility, there are men's and women's multi-stall bathrooms and a single stall bathroom. If a client is uncomfortable with the setup, we can ask like why and what would make them feel comfortable and give them options, which could include but shouldn't be limited to using the single stall bathroom or using the bathroom at a different time. So it's basically just ways to make sure that folks are feeling comfortable in the setup, but also not taking any discriminatory steps in order to meet those needs or requests. And we also recommend that in alignment with the previous slides, folks are putting this in writing in a policy somewhere, just so folks know what the expectations are and how staff go about addressing these sorts of questions or situations. Yeah, and I think that was it for this slide. Next, I'm going to go more into the family separation side of the equal access rule, but does anyone have questions before we move on to that topic? And if things are popping up for folks, don't be scared to put them in the chat. We can always come back to questions sort of at the end of the presentation section. But I will go ahead and move on to family separation. So part of preventing family separation is the expanded definition of family under the Equal Access Rule. And so we're going to review how family is defined under this rule. And in general, again, it applies to both ESG and CSC programs. And it's definitely expanding the definition of family with the intent to provide protection to any group of people presenting together for services. And so under the Equal Access Rule, family includes but's not limited to, regardless of marital status, actual or perceived sexual orientation, or gender identity, the following. So it provides examples, but it really emphasizes that this is not an exhaustive list. For example, a group of persons residing together, including a family with or without children, an elderly family, a disabled family, a displaced family, these would all be considered families under the Equal Access Rule. A single person who might be elderly, displaced, or disabled, or any other single person, that would also be considered a household under the Equal Access Rule. But basically, this is just, again, this expanded definition exists in order to ensure that families are able to be served together and they don't face involuntary separation off of sort of like a program's assumption of what family is or who is presenting together for services. So just a little bit more in terms of family separation and family definition. Family is family basically regardless of any marital status or any perceived sexual orientation or gender expression. This is meaning that any group of persons presenting for assistance together with or without children, doesn't matter their age, their relationship status. If they're presenting as a family, they must be considered and served as a family. So put a little bit differently, any group of folks that are coming to you for assistance and identifying themselves as a family are considered to be a family and they must be served together as such. So also a recipient or subrecipient, different programs receiving funds under the ESG or CSC programs. On the flip side, they cannot discriminate against a group of people presenting as a family based on their composition. So for example, if it's just adults or adults and children, or just a group of youth presenting together, their age, their disability status, marital status, all of those things in addition to perceived or actual sexual orientation and gender identity cannot be used to involuntarily separate folks trying to be served. And then for the next slide, we just wanted to throw out some examples as well. So for example, a shelter can't separate teenage boys from their families. A program can't separate out or deny assistance to adult men that present as a part of a family, whether that's fathers, uncles, mom's boyfriend, dad's boyfriend, etc. A shelter housing program may limit assistance to households with children, but it can't limit assistance to only women with children. If two adults present together as a family for housing, you must serve the two adults as a family. And you can't require anything like proof of marriage or limit assistance to couples in a heterosexual relationship. That would be a direct violation of the family definition and the equal access rule. And additionally, a housing program wouldn't be able to reduce the size of a family because one child is in foster care. Even if a child is separated from the family and is in foster care, they would still be considered part of the family in the household under the equal access rule. Okay, one more slide, I think, and then I will stop for questions. So in terms of different examples of accommodating families, ways to problem solve around that. If a shelter has private rooms in which a family can stay together, then the family must be able to stay in that room together if they choose, so they can be served together. And then, for example, if a program has a standard practice of putting down mats in a conference room for everyone who's considered overflow or beyond the capacity of the shelter itself, then it can shelter a family together in that space. And if a standard practice is to place a family in their own room, it would be acceptable to leave a bed empty to accommodate the family. So, for example, a family of 4 could stay in a unit of 5 beds, and the 5th bed could be open in order to keep them together, if that's available and if that's the preference. And then, if a family presents for permanent housing and one child is in foster care, it would be acceptable to house them in a larger unit and document that it's necessary for family reunification and for that child that's in foster care to be able to live with their family again. In terms of if a shelter program does not have capacity to serve all members of family together, I think that's a question that we've seen before. They should still aim to provide all potential options or accommodations they can, just so the family can decide on a course of action. Remember, it's involuntary separation. So we really want to make sure that folks are well informed about the options that are available to them. So depending on the facility, this could, for example, mean placing folks as close together as possible, next door to each other if there are different rooms in a shared area, shared room. Additionally, programs want to make sure that they're not denying assistance based on any interpretation of gender identity or family status. So, for example, not placing a family with 2 women and a child together, but still placing a family with a man, woman, and a child together. And also just to also say that implementing equal access doesn't mean a shelter has to build new facilities, right? We know that there are like certain constraints around, time, funding that folks have, but it does mean that they should work with the facilities they have to see what kinds of accommodations could be possible and that they would be able to do. I think that is it for the family separation section. Are there any questions on equal access or this section that I just covered before we head into some scenarios? Okay. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. And if folks can just give me like a thumbs up or come off camera just so I know that you're still with us. Oh, go ahead. Okay. Cool. Perfect.
Actually, yes, I do have a question. Are we doing
Yeah.
best practices or are we going straight to breakouts?
We are doing best practices. Sorry, Eli. Yes, I'll pass it back to Eli to go over one more short section before we go into breakouts.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Okay. All right, so before we send you into breakouts, knowing the rule is one thing, and then like in the moment or in practice, being able to apply the rule is another. So we have some. We're going to go quickly over some best practices, and we have some, as Joy said, some scenarios we're going to do in breakouts, and also another plug for we have this 6-hour training that I think we have found helps to set folks up better, particularly if you're leaving this training feeling a little unsure about what this means for you and how do you do this? How do you wrap your mind around it? How do you wrap your practice around it? That 6-hour training can be helpful. A good next step. Okay, but best practice, right? This whole slide is about let someone tell you who they are. That goes for someone's name, someone's gender. This applies to HMIS as well. It is okay and appropriate to change someone's name and gender marker in their HMIS profile if they give you a name or gender that is not what's already in HMIS. It is also appropriate to let them know, hey, awesome, thank you for sharing that information. That's not what's in HMIS right now. Would you like me to change that in HMIS? To let them, have that choice, because just something they disclose to you or share with you may not be something that they want in the HMIS database, but it may be. So it's always good to ask that. Use a pronoun that they say that they use. Practice is good for this. If someone uses a pronoun and that's not immediately the pronoun that pops into your head when you talk to them or see them, that doesn't make you a bad person, but it does mean that you should practice that and practice that on your own time so that you can use the pronoun that they use. And then even if you're taking ID as part of your intake process and you're seeing a gender marker on an ID or a birth certificate, that you ignore that. You use the gender identity or the gender that they gave you when you were doing the intake questions. And then other things about enrollment and intake. So there are it is a standard thing in intake to ask, going back here, about someone's name and also to ask them their gender. That's a standard HMIS data field. It's a standard thing on intake forms. But you don't have to ask, and you shouldn't ask about the client's sex assigned at birth. I'm going to say something that sounds a little bit extreme, but I'm doing this to make a point. When you're asking someone about their sex assigned at birth, you are basically, in a sense, asking to look in their pants. And that is not, or alternatively, asking about their private medical history, right? And that's not something that you need if you're going to be providing shelter or housing services. So yes, ask about gender, because that's a required element for a lot of folks. We don't need to ask about someone's sex assigned at birth, or about their physiological characteristics. And if in general, right? I know it's a good practice to do intake or enrollment conversations, any kind of case management conversations in an area that feels and is confidential, that provides privacy. I know that not everybody has the opportunity to do that. I know a lot of shelter setups really aren't built for that. But specifically, if you have someone who has disclosed to you part of their identity and you can offer services around that and you want to see if they're interested in that, do find a private or confidential space to do that. If you're talking about, unless they're bringing it up in a public space and they're totally cool with it, you don't ever want to assume someone's feeling of safety or comfort talking about their identity. And then if you work in a program that offers services based on gender, so a gender or sex segregated shelter, or other program that is, a program for women, a program for men, it is like equal access rule expects you to serve clients based on their gender identity and regardless of their sex assigned at birth or their gender expression. And then if a client is non-binary, if you're a program that serves women and a participant, or a program that has a men's shelter and a women's shelter, someone comes in and says, I don't identify as a man or a woman, I am non-binary or some other identity. Talk about the options. Talk about, well, this is our women's shelter, this is our men's shelter, and this is how they work, this is the physical layout, and ask them what would be most comfortable for them. That is the best practice that we strongly recommend. And then when someone is in the program, it's really important that you show up, specifically by, if there's harassment happening, right? This is just a standard thing, right? Harassment is something you need to respond to. That includes harassment or unwanted attention um, related to someone's identity. So have training and have a process and have something in place to quickly respond to incidents of harassment, incidents of any type of inappropriate behavior that makes the space unsafe. And then make sure that you are always trying to grow your comfort to model that appropriate, respectful, best practice way of supporting our friends and neighbors and clients who are LGBTQIA+. And by modeling that respectfulness, you help create an environment. You help create a culture in your organization where, you set a tone, right? And then being prepared to like actively coach other clients who are being disrespectful, who are creating an unsafe environment, or who are just asking genuine, honest questions that can be answered, but probably shouldn't be addressed like with the LGBTQIA plus person in the room, right? There can be a valid question that needs to be addressed and is not bad per se, that makes other people feel uncomfortable, right? So a question about like, I just want to know, why is this person in a women's shelter, right? That's a valid question. You can address that in private with the person who has the question and not have the sort of woman whose identity is being questioned have to deal with that, right? You want to make sure that they are protected from that so that they feel comfortable and not have to defend their presence on their own. If that makes sense. And then just make sure that, or just try to be general and open in the way that you offer services. Like again, someone's gender identity may not match up in the way we expect with the types of medical care that they may want and need. Someone who presents in a masculine way and identifies as is a man in your program may still need to be connected to a obstetrician, may still need to be connected to, or have feminine hygiene projects, right? So really making sure that you're not pigeonholing people into the services that you expect them to need. Being ready and prepared and practiced to explain to folks that like this person's gender expression does not make you unsafe. This is something that we hear a lot about clients who are sharing space, right? That I'm afraid of, to sleep next to or sleep in the room with a trans person or a gay person because I don't want them to touch me or attack me. And that's just not a thing that is an actual danger, right? In fact, gay and trans people are much, much more likely to be on the receiving end of violence or harassment than to be perpetrating that. But it is a fear that people have. So being able to educate and talk to people about that fear is important. And then, of course, not zero tolerance of bullying in all aspects is something that we recommend. And then for time, Joy, I'm just going to pass back to you to kick off the scenarios.
Cool.
So we have a good long time for that.
Sounds good.
Actually, I lied.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna skip that last slide, but I'm gonna pause for questions. You were so good with that. And this is like the practical stuff. So go ahead, Art.
What did I miss? No, I'm just kidding.
We'll share the recording. Are there any questions that came up for y'all as I was going over those best practices? Okay, well, thank you all. And again, I hope to see you at our 6-hour training if you haven't taken that before.
And now it's time for breakouts. So what we're gonna do is put you in